In 1996, the jump to 3D wasn't a smooth transition, it was a mechanical crisis. While most developers were still struggling with jittery textures, broken cameras, and the sheer impossibility of moving a character through 360 degrees of freedom, a handful of titles did the unthinkable. They didn't just survive the polygon era, they engineered the blueprints for every modern game you play today. From the secret physics of momentum to the invention of the focus lock, we're stripping away the nostalgia to look at the silicon-level genius of the N64. This is the mechanical dissection of the 15 games that fixed 3D. Welcome to Gen U Games.
In the mid-90s, the industry was hitting a wall. Movement was still trapped in digital logic. Either you were standing still, or you were moving at 100% speed. There was no middle ground. When Nintendo developed Mario 64, they realized that 3D space required a sense of weight. Instead of just mapping a button to an action, they built a variable momentum system. The breakthrough wasn't just the 360-degree control, it was the friction. When you slam the analog stick in the opposite direction, Mario doesn't just snap to a new heading. He skids, he loses balance, and he fights against his own inertia. This taught us that 3D wasn't just about moving through a world, it was about the physics of mass. That feeling of weight is the foundation of every modern character controller, from the web swinging in Spider-Man to the heavy gait of Red Dead Redemption. Early 3D combat was a chaotic mess. Players were constantly wrestling with the camera while trying to track enemies, often leading to blind swings and frustrating deaths. Nintendo's solution was Z-targeting. By allowing the player to lock the camera and their character's orientation to a single point of interest, they created a fixed axis for movement. This turned the chaos of a 3D arena into circular geometry. You could now strafe, backflip, and circle vent around an enemy while never losing sight of them. It moved the camera from being a separate tool the player had to manage to being an invisible assistant. This specific logic is the grandfather of the lock-on mechanics we see today in everything from Elden Ring to Dark Souls. It solved the "where am I looking" problem that had plagued early 3D designers for years. Before GoldenEye, console shooters were incredibly simplistic. An enemy was just one big hitbox. Rareware realized that to make a shooter feel real, the player needed specific feedback. They implemented segmented skeletal mapping, which meant the game could distinguish between a shot to the head, the torso, or the limbs. If you shot a guard in the hand, they would drop their weapon. If you shot them in the leg, they would stumble and fall. This moved the genre away from bullet sponges and toward a system where precision was rewarded with physical consequences. It was the first time aiming felt like a tactical choice rather than just a click of a button. By creating reaction-based AI, Rare transformed the shooter from an arcade gallery into a sophisticated stealth action simulation that felt alive.
I'll take this one. Get the one behind me.
Star Fox 64 was the debut for the Rumble Pack, and it changed how we felt the game, literally. While the industry was focused on better pixels, Nintendo was looking at sensory feedback. They synced the internal haptic motors to specific on-screen triggers: the rumble of a heavy engine, the jolt of taking damage, or the splash of hitting water. This created a physical link between the software and the player's nervous system. It moved the experience from being purely visual to something you could actually feel in your palms. This wasn't just a gimmick. It provided essential feedback that told the player they were actually interacting with a physical world. Today, we take haptic feedback for granted, but this was the moment that proved touch was just as important as sight for deep immersion.
The PlayStation 1 was powerful, but its textures often looked jittery or warped because it lacked hardware-level perspective correction. Rareware leaned into the N64's reality coprocessor to fix this. They used a technique called MIP mapping, which essentially swaps out textures for lower resolution versions as they move further away. By combining this with vibrant, solid color art and baked lighting, they created a world that looked rock solid and clean, no matter where the camera was. They didn't chase realism, they chased consistency. They realized that the human eye is more bothered by flickering pixels than by simple shapes. That's why Banjo-Kazooie still looks sharp and intentional decades later, while many realistic games from that era have aged into a muddy, unrecognizable mess of polygons.
2, 1, go!
In 1996, water in video games was usually just a flat scrolling texture. WaveRay 64 decided to treat water as a physical obstacle. They built a procedural wave engine where the water was a moving object with its own buoyancy and physics. The waves didn't just look good, they actively pushed your jet ski around. You had to learn to ride the crests to gain speed, or dive into the troughs to stabilize. It was a 64-bit masterclass in making the environment feel alive. By calculating the vertex displacement of the water in real time, the game created a racing surface that was never the same twice. It proved that 3D could be used to simulate the unpredictable forces of nature, providing a challenge that was more about physics than memorizing a track.
Rareware used the 4-megabyte expansion pack to push the N64 to do things it was never meant to do, specifically real-time light tracking. In Perfect Dark, you could shoot out physical light sources, like lamps or neon signs, and the room would actually go dark. This wasn't just a visual trick, it was a core stealth mechanic. You could hide in the shadows you created to avoid detection, forcing the AI to search for you blindly. It proved that the N64 could handle the kind of complex lighting logic usually reserved for high-end PCs of the time. This innovation added a layer of tactical depth that wouldn't be seen again in the genre until Splinter Cell made it a staple. It transformed the map from a static stage into a destructible, reactive environment.
The N64 had a hardware limitation. It couldn't render objects far away without the game slowing to a crawl. Iguana Entertainment turned this weakness into a strength by using a distance fog, or atmospheric mist. By blanketing the jungle in a thick fog, they hid the pop-in, while simultaneously creating a sense of primal dread. You couldn't see what was 20 feet ahead, which made the dinosaur encounters feel sudden and terrifying. It's the perfect example of how technical constraints can actually improve art direction. They didn't try to hide the limitation, they made the fog the identity of the game world. This design choice turned the N64's lack of draw distance into a tool for horror, proving that what the player doesn't see is often more powerful than what they do.
3, 2, 1.
Nintendo EAD made a brave decision with F-Zero X. They decided that performance was more important than beauty. They stripped the textures off the ships and tracks to ensure the game could maintain a blistering 60 frames per second with 30 karts on screen. This prioritized input latency and smoothness over visual fluff. It remains one of the fastest feeling games ever made because it never drops a frame, regardless of the chaos. By removing high-detailed textures, they cleared up the console's processor to focus entirely on the high-speed logic of 30 independent AI drivers. It taught a generation of developers that in high-speed racing, the feel of the game, the one-to-one response of the controller, is what creates the true immersion, not the number of polygons on a ship.
To make 4-player split screen possible, Nintendo had to be incredibly clever with memory. They used a technique called billboarding, where the racers were actually high-resolution 2D sprites living inside a 3D world. These sprites were programmed to always pivot and face the camera, creating the illusion of a 3D model. This saved enough processing power to allow the N64 to focus on the complex track designs without lagging. It was a smart hybrid approach that turned the N64 into the definitive local multiplayer machine of the 90s. While competitors struggled to render 4 3D cars at once, Mario Kart 64 ran smoothly because it knew exactly where to cut corners. It was a victory of engineering over ego, proving that a clever trick can be better than raw power.
"3D fighting and wrestling games were often frustrating because characters felt floaty or disconnected. No Mercy fixed this with its grapple priority system. Instead of relying on fast button mashing, the game focused on the context of the interaction. Once you locked up in a grapple, your inputs changed based on the state of the hold. This turned a chaotic brawl into a methodical, cinematic experience where weight and timing actually mattered. It proved that 3D combat needed a structured set of rules to feel satisfying, rather than just relying on collision physics. By slowing down the action and focusing on the animation transitions, they created a tug-of-war mechanic that felt far more physical and rewarding than any other fighter on the market.
I'm hit, but not bad. I'm hit. There it is. Rope, use.
The developer Factor 5 felt that Nintendo's standard software libraries were too restrictive for their vision of space combat. So they did something radical. They wrote their own custom microcode for the N64's reality coprocessor. This allowed them to bypass the N64 fog and render massive, clear horizons with hundreds of TIE fighters on screen. It was a technical jailbreak that proved the N64 was far more powerful than people thought. It just required a developer brave enough to talk directly to the silicon. They unlocked a higher level of polygon throughput that other studios didn't even know existed. It remains a high watermark for what the hardware was actually capable of achieving when the factory standard safety limits were ignored for the sake of performance.
Rareware wanted Conker to be as expressive as a cartoon character, but standard mouth flap animations looked stiff. They used vertex morphing, a technique where they manually programmed the individual points on the character's face to shift and stretch. This allowed for genuine lip syncing and a range of facial expressions that made Conker feel alive in a way no other 64-bit character did. It was a technical peak for the system, proving that the N64 could handle cinematic acting and emotional weight long before the industry moved toward modern motion capture. They even used real-time shadows and complex textures to make the characters pop against the environment. It was a showcase of pure programming talent, pushing the Kart to its absolute limits. By the late 90s, early 3D was starting to look muddy and dated. Nintendo pivoted to a diorama aesthetic with Paper Mario. By placing flat 2D paper characters in a 3D world, they bypassed the ugly polygon problem entirely. It proved that artistic style is more durable than graphical fidelity. Because the game didn't try to look realistic, it hasn't aged a day. It's one of the few N64 games that still looks vibrant and intentional in 2026, proving that a great aesthetic can survive any hardware cycle. They used the 3D depth to create puzzles that played with perspective, turning a hardware limitation into a core gameplay mechanic. It was a masterclass in visual branding, showing that sometimes the best way to move forward is to look at things differently.
Tough.
Developed by Treasure, this game solved the 3D aiming problem before dual analog sticks were standard. They used a hybrid control map, moving character movement to the left hand, D-pad, and aiming to the right hand, analog stick. This split-brain layout allowed for the precision of a light gun game while still giving the player full mobility. It was a prophetic design that essentially invented the layout for modern twin-stick shooters before the second stick even existed on a standard controller. It proved that the Trident N64 controller was secretly a powerhouse for dual input design if you were willing to break the rules of how people were supposed to hold it. By separating movement and aim, they delivered an arcade-level action experience that was technically impossible with a standard D-pad layout.